The Thompson Submachine Gun is an American submachine gun, invented by John T. Thompson in 1918, that became infamous during the Prohibition era, becoming a signature weapon of various organized crime syndicates in the United States. It was a common sight in the media of the time, being used by both law enforcement officers and criminals. The Thompson submachine gun was also known informally as the Tommy gun, Annihilator, Chicago typewriter, Chicago piano, Chicago style, Chicago organ grinder, trench broom, trench sweeper, the chopper, and simply the Thompson. The Thompson was favored by soldiers, criminals, police, and civilians alike for its large .45 ACP cartridge, accuracy, and high volume of fully automatic fire. It has since gained popularity among civilian collectors for its historical significance. It has had, and continues to have, considerable significance in popular culture, especially in works about the U.S. Prohibition era and World War II, and hence is among the best-known firearms in recent history. Although the original fully automatic Thompsons are no longer produced, numerous semi-automatic civilian versions are still being manufactured by Auto Ordnance. These retain a similar appearance to the original models, but they have various modifications in order to comply with U.S. firearm laws. History and service. Development. The Thompson submachine gun was developed by General John T. Thompson, who originally envisioned an auto rifle, semi-automatic rifle, to replace the bolt-action service rifles then in use. While searching for a way to allow such a weapon to operate safely without the complexity of a recoil or gas-operated mechanism, Thompson came across a patent issued to John Bell Blish in 1915 based on adhesion of inclined metal surfaces under pressure. Thompson found a financial backer, Thomas F. Ryan, and started the Auto Ordnance Company in 1916 for the purpose of developing his auto rifle. It was primarily developed in Cleveland, Ohio. The principal designers were Theodore H. Eichhoff, Oscar V. Payne, and George E. Gall. By late 1917, the limits of the Blish principle were discovered. Rather than working as a locked breech, it functioned as a friction-delayed blowback action. It was found that the only cartridge currently in U.S. service suitable for use with the lock was the .45 ACP round. Thompson then envisioned a one-man, handheld machine gun in .45 ACP as a trench broom for use in the ongoing trench warfare of World War I. Payne designed the gun itself and its stick and drum magazines. The project was then titled Annihilator I, and by 1918, most of the design issues had been resolved. However, the war ended 2 days before prototypes could be shipped to Europe. At an Auto Ordnance Board meeting in 1919 to discuss the marketing of the Annihilator, with the war now over, the weapon was officially renamed the Thompson Submachine Gun. While other weapons had been developed shortly prior with similar objectives in mind, the Thompson was the first weapon to be labeled and marketed as a submachine gun. Thompson intended the weapon as an automatic trench broom to sweep enemy troops from the trenches, filling a role for which the Browning automatic rifle, BAR, had been proven ill-suited. This concept had already been developed by German troops using their own Bergmann MP-18, the world's first submachine gun, in concert with Sturmtruppen tactics. Early use. The Thompson first entered production as the M1921. It was available to civilians, although poor sales resulted from the expense of the weapon. The Thompson gun, with one Type XX 20-shot stick magazine, was priced at $200 in 1921. Equivalent to $2,744 in 2017. M1921 Thompsons were sold in small quantities to the United States Postal Inspection Service, to protect the mail from a spate of robberies, and to the United States Marine Corps. Federal sales were followed by sales to several police departments in the U.S. and minor international sales to various armies and constabulary forces, chiefly in Central and South America. The Marines used their Thompsons in the Banana Wars and in China. It was popular with the Marines as a point defense weapon for countering ambush by Nicaraguan guerrillas, and led to the organization of 4-man fire teams with as much firepower as a 9-man rifle squad. The major complaints against the Thompson were its weight, inaccuracy at ranges over 50 yards, 46 m, and the lack of penetrating power of the .45 ACP pistol cartridge. Some of the first batches of Thompsons were bought in America by agents of the Irish Republic, notably Harry Boland. The first test of a Thompson in Ireland was performed by West Cork Brigade Commander Tom Berry in presence of IRA leader Michael Collins. A total of 653 were purchased, but 495 were seized by U.S. Customs authorities in New York in June 1921. The remainder made their way to the Irish Republican Army by way of Liverpool and were used in the last month of the Irish War of Independence, 1919-21. After a truce with the British in July 1921, the IRA imported more Thompsons and they were used in the subsequent Irish Civil War, 1922-23. They were not found to be very effective in Ireland. The Thompson caused serious casualties, death or serious injury, to those attacked in only 32% of the actions in which it was used. The Thompson achieved most of its early notoriety in the hands of Prohibition and Depression-era gangsters, motorized bandits, and the lawmen who pursued them, and in Hollywood films about their exploits, most notably in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The two Thompson guns used in the massacre, called the most famous murder weapons in the world, are still held by the Berrien County Sheriff's Department. It has been referred to by one researcher as the gun that made the 20s roar. In 1926, the Cut's Compensator, a muzzle brake, was offered as an option for the M1921. Thompsons with the Compensator were catalogued as No 21AC at the original price of $200, with the plain M1921 designated No 21A at a reduced price of $175. In 1928, Federal Laboratories took over the distribution of the weapon from Thompson's Auto Ordnance Corporation. The cost at this time was $225 per weapon, equivalent to $3,207 in 2017, with $5 per 50-round drum and $3 for 20-round magazine. Nationalist China acquired a quantity for use against Japanese land forces, and eventually began producing copies of the Thompson in small quantities for use by its armies and militias. In the 1930s, Taiyuan Arsenal produced copies of the Thompson for Yan Zishan, the warlord of Shaanxi Province. The Federal Bureau of Investigation first acquired Thompsons in 1933 following the Kansas City Massacre. World War II. In 1938, the Thompson submachine gun was adopted by the U.S. military, serving during World War II and beyond. There were two military types of Thompson SMG. The M1928A1 had provisions for box and drum magazines. It had a Cut's Compensator, cooling fins on the barrel, employed a delayed blowback action and its charging handle was on the top of the receiver. The M1 and M1A1 had a barrel without cooling fins, a simplified rear sight, provisions only for box magazines, employed a straight blowback action and the charging handle was on the side of the receiver. Over 1.5 million military Thompson submachine guns were produced during World War II. Magazine developments. Military users of the M1928A1 had complaints about the L50 round drum magazine. The British Army officially criticised their excessive weight, the rattling sound they made and shipped thousands back to the US in exchange for box magazines. The Thompson had to be cocked, bolt retracted ready to fire, to attach the drum. It attached and detached by sliding sideways, which made magazine changes slow and also created difficulty in clearing a cartridge malfunction, jam. Reloading an empty drum with cartridges was an involved process. In contrast, the XX20 round box magazine was light and compact, it tended not to rattle, and could be inserted with the bolt safely closed. It was quickly attached and detached and was removed downward, making clearing jams easier. The box tripped the bolt open lock when empty, facilitating magazine changes. An empty box was easily reloaded with loose rounds. However, users complained it was limited in capacity. In the field, some soldiers taped two XX magazines together in what would be known as jungle style to speed magazine changes. Two alternatives to the L drum and XX box magazines were tested December 6, 1941, at Fort Knox, an extended 30-round box magazine and a 40-round magazine made by welding two 20-round magazines face-to-face, jungle style. Testers considered both superior to either the XX box or L drum. The 30-round box was approved as standard in December 1941 to replace the XX and L magazines. The concept of welding two box magazines face-to-face was carried over with the UD-42 submachine gun. M1 development. The staff of Savage Arms looked for ways to simplify the M1928A1, producing a prototype in February 1942 which was tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in March 1942. Army Ordnance approved adoption as the M1 in April 1942. M1s were made by Savage Arms and by Auto Ordnance. M1s were issued with the 30-round box magazine and would accept the earlier 20-round box, but would not accept the drum magazine. Combat use. M1 development. The staff of Savage Arms looked for ways to simplify the M1928A1, producing a prototype in February 1942 which was tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in March 1942. Army Ordnance approved adoption as the M1 in April 1942. M1s were made by Savage Arms and by Auto Ordnance. M1s were issued with the 30-round box magazine and would accept the earlier 20-round box, but would not accept the drum magazine. Combat use. In the Malayan Campaign, the Burma Campaign and the Pacific Theatre, Lend-Lease issue Thompsons were used by the British Army, Indian Army, Australian Army Infantry and other Commonwealth forces. They used the Thompson extensively in jungle patrols and ambushes, where it was prized for its firepower, though it was criticized for its hefty weight and poor reliability. Difficulties in supply eventually led to its replacement in Australian Army units in 1943 by other submachine guns such as the Owen and Austin. The Thompsons were then given to the Royal Australian Air Force and Royal Australian Navy. New Zealand Commando Forces initially used Thompsons but switched them for the more reliable, lighter, and more accurate Owen during the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal campaigns. The U.S. Marines also used the Thompson as a limited-issue weapon, especially during their later island assaults. The Thompson was soon found to have limited effect in heavy jungle cover, where the low-velocity .45 bullet would not penetrate most small-diameter trees or protective armor vests. In 1923, the Army had rejected the .45 Remington Thompson, which had twice the energy of the .45 ACP. In the U.S. Army, many Pacific War jungle patrols were originally equipped with Thompsons in the early phases of the New Guinea and Guadalcanal campaigns, but soon began employing the Browning automatic rifle in its place as a point defense weapon. The Army introduced the U.S. M3 and M3A1 submachine guns in 1943 with plans to produce the latter in numbers sufficient to cancel future orders for the Thompson, while gradually withdrawing it from the first-line service. However, due to unforeseen production delays and requests for modifications, the M3/M3A1 never replaced the Thompson, and purchases continued until February 1944. At the end of World War II, the Thompson, with a total wartime production of over 1.5 million, outnumbered the M3/M3A1 submachine guns in service by nearly 3 to 1. After World War II, Thompson submachine guns were used by both sides during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Following the war, Thompsons were issued to members of Israel's elite Unit 101, upon the formation of that unit in 1953. During the Greek Civil War, the Thompson submachine gun was used by both sides. The Hellenic armed forces, gendarmerie, and police units were equipped with Thompson submachine guns supplied by the British and later in the war by the United States. The opposing communist fighters of the Democratic Army of Greece were also using Thompson submachine guns, either captured from government forces or inherited from Ellis. Ellis was the strongest of the resistance forces during the period of Greek resistance against the Germans and Italians and were supplied with arms from both the British and the United States. After the demobilization of Ellis, an unspecified number of arms were not surrendered to the government but kept hidden, and were later used by the Democratic Army of Greece. The Thompson also found service with the KNIL during their attempt to retake their former colony of Indonesia. Captured examples were later used by Indonesian forces against Dutch forces. By the time of the Korean War, the Thompson had seen much use by the US and South Korean military, even though Thompson had been replaced as standard issue by the M3/M3A1. With huge numbers of guns available in Army ordnance arsenals, the Thompson remained classed as limited standard or substitute standard long after the standardization of the M3/M3A1. Many Thompsons were distributed to Chinese armed forces as a military aid before the fall of Chiang Kai-shek's government to Mao Zedong's communist forces in 1949 during the Chinese Civil War. During the Korean War, American troops were surprised to encounter Chinese communist troops heavily armed with Thompsons, especially during surprise night assaults. The gun's ability to deliver large quantities of short-range automatic assault fire proved very useful in both defense and assault during the early part of the conflict. Many of these weapons were captured and placed into service with American soldiers and Marines for the balance of the war. During the Cuban Revolution, the Thompson submachine gun was used by some of Fidel Castro's guerrillas. During the Vietnam War, some South Vietnamese army units and defense militia were armed with Thompson submachine guns, and a few of these weapons were used by reconnaissance units, advisors, and other American troops. It was later replaced by the M16 assault rifle. Not only did some U.S. soldiers have use of them in Vietnam, but they encountered them as well. The Viet Cong liked the weapon and used both captured models as well as manufacturing their own copies in small jungle workshops. The Australian government destroyed most of their Thompson machine carbines in the 1960s. They shipped their remaining stocks to arm the forces of Lon Nol's Khmer Republic in 1975. They were then captured and used by the Khmer Rouge. In the conflict in Northern Ireland, known as the Troubles, 1969–1998, the Thompson was again used by the Irish Republican paramilitaries. According to historian Peter Hart, the Thompson remained a key part of both the official IRA and provisional IRA arsenals until well into the 1970s when it was superseded by the Armalite and the AK-47. The Thompson was also used by U.S. and overseas law enforcement and police forces, most prominently by the FBI. The FBI used Thompsons until they were declared obsolete and ordered destroyed in the early 1970s. Collector interest. Because of their quality and craftsmanship, as well as their gangster era and World War II connections, Thompsons are sought as collector's items. There were fewer than 40 pre-production prototypes. The Colt Patent Firearms Manufacturing Company in Hartford, Connecticut was contracted by the Auto Ordnance Corporation to manufacture the initial mass production of 15,000 Thompson submachine guns in 1920. An original Colt Model 1921 AORAC, Model 1927 AORAC, Model 1928 Navy AORAC, properly registered in working condition with original components can easily fetch from $25,000 US to $45,000 plus depending on condition and accessories. For World War II, approximately 1,700,000 Thompson submachine guns were produced by Auto Ordnance and Savage Arms, with 1,387,134 being the simplified World War II M1 and M1A1 variants, without the Blish lock and oiling system. A Model 1921A believed to have been owned by Bonnie and Clyde, but without historical documentation to substantiate this provenance, sold at auction on January 21, 2012, in Kansas City for $130,000. Features. Operating characteristics. Early versions of the Thompson, the Model 1919, had a fairly high cyclic rate of fire, as high as 1,200 rounds per minute, RPM, with most Model 1921s at 800 RPM. In 1927, the U.S. Navy ordered 500 Thompsons but requested a lower rate of fire. Thompson requested Payne develop a method of reducing the cyclic rate of fire. Payne replaced the actuator with a heavier one and the recoil spring with a stiffer one. The changes reduced the rate of fire from 800 to the 600 RPM of the U.S. Navy Model 1928. Later M1 and M1A1 Thompsons averaged also 600 RPM. This rate of fire, combined with a rather heavy trigger pull and a stock with an excessive drop, increases the tendency for the barrel to climb off target in automatic fire. Compared to more modern submachine guns, the .45 Thompson is quite heavy, weighing roughly the same as the contemporary M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle, and requires lots of cleaning. This was one of the major complaints about the weapon by U.S. Army personnel to whom it was issued. Although the drum magazine provided significant firepower, in military service it was found to be overly heavy and bulky, especially when slung on the shoulder while marching. The M1928A1 Thompson drum magazine was rather fragile, and cartridges tended to rattle inside it, producing unwanted noise. For these reasons, the 20-round and later 30-round box magazines soon proved most popular with military users of the M1928A1, and drum compatibility was not included in the design of the wartime M1 and M1A1 models. The Thompson was one of the earliest submachine guns to incorporate a double-column, double-feed box magazine design, which undoubtedly contributed to the gun's reputation for reliability. In addition, the gun performed better than most after exposure to rain, dirt, and mud. The selective fire, semi or fully automatic, Thompson fires from the open bolt position, in which the bolt is held fully to rearward by the sear when cocked. When the trigger is depressed, the bolt is released, traveling forward to chamber and simultaneously fire the first and subsequent rounds until either the trigger is released or the ammunition is exhausted. This eliminates the risk of cook-off, which can sometimes occur in closed-bolt automatic weapons. Disassembly. The Thompson submachine gun varies in field strip procedure, depending on the variant. World War II-era M1 variants and RPB models field strip more easily than the M1921. The 1928 variant can be disassembled easily by first detaching the stock, then sliding off the lower receiver and then simply removing the internal parts, cleaning them, and then putting it back together. When opened up, the Thompson features a small number of parts that need to be removed, including the spring, bolt, blish lock, and actuator bolt. Variants. Prototypes. Persuader and Annihilator. There were two main experimental models of the Thompson. The Persuader was a belt-fed version developed in 1917/18. It was partially built, but never completely finished. The Annihilator, serial number 1 to 10, was similar in appearance to the later models, but without rear sight and buttstock mounts. The first were fed from a 20-round box magazine. Later, the 50 and 100-round drum magazines were developed. Model 1919. Starting with the serial number 11, the Model 1919 takes the final appearance of the later Thompsons with the rear sights and the buttstock. The Model 1919 was limited to about 40 units. The first built did not use the drums, as it was too difficult to fire. Many variations have been noted within this model. The weapons had very high cyclic rates up to 1,500 RPM. This was the weapon Brigadier General Thompson demonstrated at Camp Perry in 1920. A number of Model 1919s were made without buttstocks, rear and front sights, but the final version closely resembled the later Model 1921. This model was designed to sweep trenches with bullets. The New York City Police Department was the largest purchaser of the M1919. Some experimental calibers aside the .45 ACP, 11.4 x 23 mm, were the .22 LR, .32 ACP, .38 ACP, and 9 mmP. .351 WSL variant. Only one prototype was made in .351 WSL using a standard 20 barrel and an ROF of 1000 RPM. Thompson .30 Carbine. The layout and ergonomics of the Thompson submachine gun were also considered for the role of a light rifle before the adoption of the M1 Carbine. It was based on the M1921/27 variants. However, it was turned down without testing due to logistic problems. .3006 variant. A .3006 variant was intended as a rival to the M1918 bar. It had an extended receiver with a recoil buffer and fed from 20-round magazines. Production. Model 1921. The Model 1921, M1921, was the first major production model. 15,000 were produced by Colt for auto ordnance. In its original design, it was finished more like a sporting weapon, with an adjustable rear sight, a blued, finned barrel and vertical foregrip, or pistol grip, and the Blish lock. The M1921 was quite expensive to manufacture, with the original retail price around $200, because of its high-quality wood furniture and finely machined parts. The M1921 was famous throughout its career with police and criminals and in motion pictures. This model gained fame from its use by criminals during Prohibition, and was nicknamed Tommy Gun by the media. Model 1923. The Model 1923 was a heavy submachine gun introduced to potentially expand the auto ordnance product line and was demonstrated for the U.S. Army. It fired the more powerful .45 Remington Thompson cartridge, which fired a heavier 250 gr, 0.57 ounces, 16 grams, bullet at muzzle velocities of about 1,450 feet/s, 440 m/s, and energy about 1,170 ft-lb, 1,590 J, with greater range than the .45 ACP. It introduced a horizontal forearm, improved inline stock for accuracy, 14 in, 36 cm, barrel, bipod, and bayonet lug. The M1923 was intended to rival the M1918 Browning automatic rifle, BAR, with which the Army was already satisfied. The Army did not give the Model 1923 much consideration, so it was not adopted. Model 1921AC, 1926. While not a new model in the usual sense of incorporating major changes, in 1926 the Cut's Compensator, a muzzle brake, was offered as an option for the M1921. Thompsons with the Compensator were catalogued as No 21AC at the original price of $200, with the plain M1921 designated No 21A at a reduced price of $175. The Model 1921 was thereafter referred to as Model 1921A or Model 1921AC, though some collectors still refer to it as the Model 1921. Model 1928. The Model 1928 was the first type widely used by military forces, with the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps as major buyers through the 1930s. The original Model 1928s were Model 1921s with weight added to the actuator, which slowed down the cyclic rate of fire, a United States Navy requirement. On these guns, the model number 1921 on the receiver was updated by stamping an 8 over the last one. The Navy Model 1928 has several names among collectors: the Colt Overstamp, 1921 Overstamp, 28 Navy, or just 28N. The 1928 Thompson would be the last small arm adopted by the U.S. Army that used a year designation in the official nomenclature. With the start of World War II, major contracts from several countries saved the manufacturer from bankruptcy. A notable variant of the Model 1928 with an aluminum receiver and tenite grip, buttstock, and fore-end, was made by Savage. M1928A1. The M1928A1 variant entered mass production before the attack on Pearl Harbor, as on-hand stocks ran out. Changes included a horizontal fore-end, in place of the distinctive vertical foregrip, pistol grip, and a provision for a military sling. Despite new U.S. contracts for Lend-Lease shipments abroad to China, France, and the United Kingdom, as well as the needs of American armed forces, only 2 factories supplied M1928A1 Thompsons during the early years of World War II. Though it could use both the 50-round drum and the 20 or 30-round box magazines, active service showed the drums were more prone to jamming, rattled when moving, and were too heavy and bulky on long patrols. 562,511 were made. Wartime production variants had a fixed rear sight without the triangular sight guard wings and a non-ribbed barrel, both like those found on the M1/M1A1. In addition, the Soviet Union received M1928A1s, included as standard equipment with the M3 light tanks obtained through Lend-Lease. The weapons were never issued to the Red Army because of a lack of .45 ACP ammunition on the Eastern Front. They were simply put in storage, although a picture exists of what appears to be Thompsons being used by Russian M3 Stuart crews in the Caucasus. As of September 2006, limited numbers of these weapons have been re-imported from Russia to the United States as disassembled spare parts kits, comprising the entire weapon less the receiver, as required by federal law. An M1928A1, which also came with an unusual inline stock, modified with elevated sights to increase accuracy, also existed. Service variants: Thompson Machine Carbine, TMC. In 1940, Commonwealth troops in Egypt and North Africa were issued commercial model Lend-Lease Colt and Savage manufactured M1928s. Section leaders carried them instead of pistols or rifles. Many of the Colt models had French-language manuals packed with them, as they had been abruptly diverted to England after the fall of France. They soon discovered that the weapon was prone to jamming due to sand. To fix this, the armourers removed the blish lock and replaced it with a hex bolt to keep the cocking handle and bolt together. The 20-round Type XX magazines had their peepholes welded shut to keep sand out, and the 50-round Type L drums were discontinued. Ammunition was scarce, as it was either in small lots of Lend-Lease commercial ammo or obtained from adjacent American troops. It was later replaced by the 9mm Sten gun and Lanchester SMG. The Japanese captured enough Thompson M1928 SMGs and ammunition when they captured Hong Kong and Malaysia that it became a limited standard weapon. It surpassed any similar weapons currently in their service. Ammunition was usually in US 42-round Lend-Lease commercial cartons or Australian 28-round military cartons captured from the Commonwealth forces that was sampled, tested, and resealed with Japanese arsenal stickers. Models used in the Pacific by Australian troops had their sling swivels remounted on the left side to allow it to be fired more easily while prone. A metal sling mount was fitted to the left side of the wooden buttstock. Ammunition was manufactured in Australia or obtained from adjacent American troops. It was later replaced by the Owen machine carbine. M1. Responding to a request for further simplification, the M1 was standardized in April 1942 as the United States Submachine Gun, Cal. 45, M1. Rate of fire was reduced to approximately 600 to 700 rpm. First issued in 1943, the M1 uses a simple blowback operation, with the charging handle moved to the side. The flip-up adjustable Lyman rear sight was replaced with a fixed L sight. Late M1s had triangular guard wings added to the rear L sight, which were standardized on the M1A1. The slots adjoining the magazine well allowing the use of a drum magazine were removed. A new magazine catch with the provision for retaining drum magazines removed, was produced, but most M1s and later M1A1s retained the original. The less expensive and more easily manufactured stick magazines were used exclusively in the M1, with a new 30-round version joining the familiar 20-round type. The Cut's compensator, barrel cooling fins, and blish lock were omitted while the buttstock was permanently affixed. Late production M1 stocks were fitted with reinforcing bolts and washers to prevent splitting of the stock where it attached to the receiver. The British had used improvised bolts or wood screws to reinforce M1928 stocks. The M1 reinforcing bolt and washer were carried over to the M1A1 and retrofitted to many of the M1928A1s in US and British service. Late M1s also had simplified fire control switches, also carried over to the M1A1. M1A1. The M1A1, standardized in October 1942 as the United States Submachine Gun, Cal. 45, M1A1, could be produced in half the time of the M1928A1, and at a much lower cost. The main difference between the M1 and M1A1 was the bolt. The M1 bolt had a floating firing pin and hammer, the bolt of the M1A1 had the firing pin machined to the face of the bolt, eliminating unnecessary parts. The reinforced stock and protective sight wings were standard. The 30-round magazine became more common. In 1939, Thompsons cost the government $209 apiece. By the spring of 1942, cost reduction design changes had brought this down to $70. In February 1944, the M1A1 reached a low price of $45 each, including accessories and spare parts, although the difference in price between the M1 and M1A1 was only 6 cents. By the end of the war, the M1A1 was replaced with the even lower cost M3, commonly called the grease gun. Semi-automatic. Model 1927. The Model 1927 was the open-bolt semi-automatic only version of the M1921. It was made by modifying an existing Model 1921, including replacing SIRT.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.